The morning mist clung to the rugged peaks of the Sierra Madre Oriental like ghostly fingers, obscuring the fate that would soon befall thousands of men on both sides of a brutal war. Captain Robert E. Lee pressed his field glasses against his eyes, studying the seemingly impregnable Mexican fortifications that crowned Cerro Gordo, the fat hill that blocked the American Army's path to Mexico City in April of 1847. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna had chosen his ground with the eye of a seasoned military commander. The narrow mountain pass offered only one apparent route through the treacherous terrain, and he had positioned his 4,000 Mexican soldiers with deadly precision along the heights. Artillery pieces gleamed menacingly from carefully constructed earthworks, their black muzzles trained on the winding road below, where any attacking force would be funneled into a killing field. The Mexican president and general had learned from his devastating defeat at San Jacinto 11 years prior, and he was determined that this mountain stronghold would become the graveyard of American ambitions. Major General Winfield Scott, commanding the American forces, stood beside Lee on a rocky outcrop, his weathered face grim as he contemplated the challenge before them. The Mexican-American War had been raging for nearly 2 years, and Scott's amphibious landing at Veracruz had been a masterpiece of military coordination. But now, barely 30 miles inland from the coast, his army of 9,000 men faced what appeared to be an insurmountable obstacle. The narrow road through the pass was the only known route to the Mexican capital, and Santa Anna's forces held every advantage of terrain and defensive positioning. The stakes could not have been higher. President James Knox Polk's vision of manifest destiny hung in the balance, along with the lives of thousands of soldiers who had followed their commanders into this forbidding landscape. The American public, initially enthusiastic about the war, had grown increasingly divided as casualties mounted and the conflict dragged on. A catastrophic defeat here would likely force the United States to abandon its territorial ambitions and accept a negotiated peace that would leave Mexico largely intact. Lee folded his field glasses and turned to General Scott with a thoughtful expression. The young engineer officer had spent the previous day conducting a dangerous reconnaissance mission, crawling through dense brush and rocky terrain while Mexican sentries patrolled nearby. What he had discovered would soon change the entire character of the battle and, ultimately, the war itself. Hidden from Mexican observers by thick vegetation and treacherous terrain, Lee had found a narrow goat path that wound around the left flank of Santa Anna's position, a route so difficult and seemingly impassable that the Mexican commander had left it virtually unguarded. As the sun climbed higher over the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley floor, both armies prepared for a confrontation that would determine whether the American advance would continue toward Mexico City or end in bloody failure among these unforgiving peaks. The Battle of Cerro Gordo was about to begin, and its outcome would reshape the destiny of two nations. The pre-dawn darkness of April 17, 1847, provided perfect cover as Captain Robert E. Lee led a select group of American engineers and soldiers along the treacherous path he had discovered during his reconnaissance. The route was barely worthy of the name, a narrow track that had been carved by mountain goats and the occasional local shepherd, winding precariously around rocky outcrops and through dense thickets of thorny brush that tore at uniforms and exposed flesh. General Scott had embraced Lee's audacious plan with the enthusiasm of a commander who understood that conventional tactics would result in a massacre. While Brigadier General David E. Twiggs would launch a diversionary assault along the main road to fix Santa Anna's attention, the bulk of the American force would attempt the seemingly impossible flanking movement. The plan required absolute silence and precise coordination. If discovered prematurely, the American troops would find themselves trapped on an exposed mountainside with no means of escape. This account draws from detailed military records preserved in the National Archives, as documented by historian John S. D. Eisenhower in his comprehensive study of the Mexican-American War. Lieutenant Pierre Gustave Touton Beauregard, serving as one of Scott's engineering officers, had worked through the night with Lee to mark the most passable sections of the route with strips of white cloth barely visible in the darkness. The young Louisiana officer would later gain fame during the Civil War, but on this morning, his focus was entirely devoted to ensuring that nearly 7,000 American soldiers could navigate the treacherous terrain without alerting the Mexican defenders. As the flanking force began its movement, the main body of Mexican troops remained focused on the road below, where Twiggs had positioned his artillery to create the impression of an imminent frontal assault. Santa Anna himself was confident that his position was unassailable. The Mexican general had positioned his best troops, including seasoned regulars and experienced artillery crews, along what he believed were the only approaches to his mountain fortress. His left flank, protected by what appeared to be impassable terrain, was held by only a token force of raw recruits and militia. The American advance proceeded with agonizing slowness as soldiers struggled to maintain their footing on loose scree and navigate around massive boulders. Officers moved up and down the column, whispering urgent commands to maintain silence and cohesion. Equipment had been stripped to essentials, heavy packs abandoned in favor of ammunition, water, and the tools needed to clear obstacles from the primitive path. By mid-morning, the lead elements of the flanking force had achieved what many had thought impossible. They had successfully worked their way around the Mexican left flank and occupied positions that would allow them to strike at Santa Anna's forces from an entirely unexpected direction. The Mexican defenders, their attention focused on the anticipated frontal assault, remained oblivious to the thousands of American soldiers who were now poised to attack from their supposedly secure rear. General Scott, monitoring the operation from his command post, received regular reports from signal officers who had established a crude but effective communication system using mirrors to reflect sunlight. The messages were brief but encouraging. The flanking movement was proceeding according to plan, and the element of surprise appeared to be intact. The stage was now set for a coordinated assault that would catch Santa Anna's army between two forces and transform what had seemed like an impregnable defensive position into a potential death trap. The Battle of Cerro Gordo erupted with devastating suddenness on the morning of April 18, 1847, when General Scott's carefully orchestrated plan finally reached its climactic moment. The Mexican defenders, who had spent a restless night anticipating an American frontal assault, were utterly unprepared for the coordinated attack that struck them from multiple directions simultaneously. Captain Lee's flanking force struck first, emerging from the dense brush and rocky terrain like avenging spirits. The surprised Mexican militia manning the supposedly secure left flank broke almost immediately, abandoning their positions in panic as American soldiers swarmed over their hastily constructed earthworks. The psychological impact of this unexpected assault rippled through Santa Anna's entire defensive line as word spread that the Americans had somehow appeared behind their positions. Brigadier General James Shields, commanding one of the flanking columns, pressed the attack with relentless determination, despite suffering a severe wound early in the engagement. His soldiers, inspired by their commander's courage, fought with the ferocity of men who understood that retreat down the treacherous mountain path would likely prove impossible. The Mexican defenders, caught between the advancing Americans and the precipitous terrain behind them, found themselves trapped in an increasingly desperate situation. The roar of artillery echoed off the mountain walls as both sides brought their guns into action. Mexican cannoneers, trained to fire down the main road, struggled to redirect their pieces to meet the unexpected threat from their flank and rear. American artillery, manhandled up the steep slopes by teams of soldiers and engineers, began to find the range and poured devastating fire into the confused Mexican formations. Santa Anna himself galloped frantically between his scattered units, attempting to rally his demoralized troops and establish some semblance of a coherent defense. The Mexican general, resplendent in his ornate uniform despite the chaos surrounding him, presented a conspicuous target as he rode across the battlefield, shouting commands and trying to restore order to his crumbling lines. His artificial leg, a consequence of wounds suffered in an earlier conflict with the French, made mounting and dismounting difficult, but his personal courage remained unquestioned. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph E. Johnston, leading another element of the American assault, found himself engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat as his men stormed a Mexican battery position. The fighting was brutal and personal, with bayonets, sabers, and rifle butts replacing the more distant killing of artillery exchanges. Mexican gunners, trained to serve their pieces with disciplined precision, fought desperately to prevent their cannon from falling into American hands, knowing that the loss of these weapons would doom any hope of maintaining their defensive positions. The tide of battle turned decisively when American forces captured the key Mexican artillery positions that commanded the main road. With their guns now silent, Santa Anna's remaining troops found themselves exposed to devastating fire from their own former positions. The psychological impact was crushing. Soldiers who had felt secure behind their mountain fortress now realized that their defensive advantages had been completely negated by the American flanking maneuver. As the morning progressed, what had begun as a coordinated Mexican defense disintegrated into scattered pockets of resistance. Individual units, cut off from their commanders and surrounded by advancing American forces, fought desperate delaying actions while their comrades streamed toward the rear in increasing disorder. The mountain passes that had seemed to guarantee Mexican victory now became corridors of retreat as Santa Anna's army began to collapse under the weight of Scott's masterfully executed assault. The collapse of Santa Anna's defensive line at Cerro Gordo transformed from an orderly withdrawal into a catastrophic rout as panic spread through the Mexican ranks like wildfire. Soldiers who had maintained their positions with stubborn courage throughout the morning now abandoned their weapons and equipment in a desperate flight towards safety. The narrow mountain roads, which had been carefully chosen for their defensive advantages, became death traps as thousands of fleeing soldiers crowded into passages barely wide enough for single-file movement. General Scott, recognizing the opportunity to inflict decisive damage on the Mexican army, ordered an immediate pursuit. American cavalry, which had played little role in the initial assault due to the difficult terrain, now thundered down the mountain roads in hot pursuit of the retreating enemy. The sound of hoofbeats echoed ominously through the passes as Mexican soldiers threw away muskets, ammunition, and personal possessions in their haste to escape the advancing Americans. Captain Lee, his uniform torn and stained from the morning's fighting, coordinated the pursuit with the same methodical precision he had brought to the flanking maneuver. American engineers worked frantically to clear obstacles from the roads, while infantry units pressed forward, determined to prevent Santa Anna's forces from establishing new defensive positions further inland. The momentum of victory carried the American army forward with an energy that seemed to surprise even their own commanders. The Mexican retreat quickly devolved into complete chaos as units became separated from their officers and soldiers lost contact with their formations. Santa Anna himself barely escaped capture when American cavalry overran his field headquarters, seizing his personal baggage, official correspondence, and even his spare artificial leg. The indignity of losing such personal items added insult to the injury of military defeat and became a source of embarrassment that would haunt the Mexican general for years to come. According to military historians and contemporary accounts preserved in the Library of Congress, the speed and completeness of the Mexican collapse surprised even the most optimistic American commanders. Lieutenant Beauregard, riding with the pursuing cavalry, witnessed scenes of complete military dissolution as entire Mexican regiments simply melted away into the countryside. Officers abandoned their commands, soldiers discarded their uniforms to blend in with local civilians, and artillery pieces were left by the roadside when their crews fled rather than face capture. The psychological impact of the defeat was perhaps even more devastating than the material losses, As word spread throughout Mexico that Santa Anna's supposedly invincible mountain fortress had been captured with relative ease. The human cost of the battle was staggering, though concentrated almost entirely among the Mexican forces. American casualties were remarkably light, considering the apparent strength of the defensive positions they had assaulted. Fewer than 70 killed and wounded compared to over 1,000 Mexican casualties and 3,000 prisoners. The lopsided nature of these losses reflected both the effectiveness of Scott's tactical plan and the complete collapse of Mexican morale once their defensive positions had been compromised. As evening fell over the Sierra Madre Oriental, American soldiers found themselves in possession of a battlefield littered with abandoned equipment and supplies. 43 pieces of artillery, thousands of small arms, and enormous quantities of ammunition fell into American hands, representing a military disaster of unprecedented proportions for Mexican forces. The road to Mexico City, which had seemed blocked by an impregnable fortress only 24 hours earlier, now lay open to Scott's advancing army. The strategic implications of the victory at Cerro Gordo extended far beyond the immediate military situation, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the entire Mexican-American War and bringing the conflict significantly closer to its eventual conclusion. The stunning American victory at Cerro Gordo sent shockwaves throughout Mexico that extended far beyond the immediate military consequences of the battle. News of Santa Anna's catastrophic defeat spread rapidly through the countryside, carried by fleeing soldiers, terrified civilians, and the efficient network of local officials who suddenly found themselves confronting the reality of an advancing American army with no effective Mexican force standing between the invaders and the capital. In Mexico City, the government struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen their principal army. Santa Anna had been regarded as the nation's most experienced and capable military commander, and his confident assertions about the impregnability of his mountain fortress had given political leaders reason to believe that the American advance could be halted indefinitely in the difficult terrain of the Sierra Madre Oriental. The reality that Scott's forces had not only captured these positions, but had done so with minimal casualties, represented a psychological blow that reverberated through every level of Mexican society. General Scott, meanwhile, consolidated his remarkable victory with the systematic efficiency that had characterized his entire campaign. American engineers immediately began improving the mountain roads to facilitate the movement of supplies and reinforcements, while advance elements of the army pushed inland to prevent any possibility of Mexican forces establishing new defensive positions. The captured artillery and military supplies were cataloged and redistributed to American units, providing a significant boost to their firepower and logistics capabilities. The international implications of the battle were equally significant, particularly in European capitals where observers had been closely monitoring the progress of the war. British and French diplomatic officials, who had initially expressed skepticism about American military capabilities, now recognized that the United States possessed both the strategic vision and tactical expertise necessary to project power far beyond its traditional borders. The efficient coordination of Scott's amphibious landing at Veracruz, followed by the masterful assault at Cerro Gordo, demonstrated a level of military sophistication that commanded respect from even the most experienced European military establishments. Contemporary diplomatic correspondence housed in the British Foreign Office archives reveals the growing European concern about expanding American military capabilities during this period. President Polk, receiving news of the victory in Washington, immediately recognized its potential to accelerate the war's conclusion on terms favorable to American territorial ambitions. The psychological impact of Santa Anna's defeat would likely encourage moderate Mexican politicians to seek negotiated settlement rather than continue a conflict that appeared increasingly hopeless. Polk's vision of manifest destiny, which had seemed problematic when faced with determined Mexican resistance, now appeared achievable through military victory rather than prolonged diplomatic negotiation. The battle also had profound implications for American military doctrine and the careers of the officers who had participated in the victory. Captain Lee's innovative reconnaissance work and tactical planning had demonstrated the value of detailed intelligence gathering and flexible tactical thinking. The success of the flanking maneuver at Cerro Gordo would influence American military thinking for decades to come, emphasizing the importance of mobility, surprise, and the creative exploitation of terrain advantages. For the Mexican military establishment, the defeat represented more than a tactical setback. It was a fundamental challenge to their understanding of warfare and defensive strategy. The ease with which American forces had overcome apparently insurmountable natural obstacles and well-prepared defensive positions suggested that traditional approaches to military planning were inadequate against an enemy willing to embrace innovative tactics and accept considerable risks. As Scott's army prepared to resume its advance toward Mexico City, both sides understood that the Battle of Cerro Gordo had fundamentally altered the character of the war and made American victory increasingly inevitable. The aftermath of the Battle of Cerro Gordo established patterns that would define the remainder of the Mexican-American War and influence military thinking for generations to come. General Scott's army, now confident in its tactical superiority, and buoyed by the psychological advantages of decisive victory, resumed its advance toward Mexico City with renewed vigor and determination. The road that had seemed impassable just days earlier now carried American troops, artillery, and supply wagons in a continuous stream toward the heart of Mexico. Santa Anna, his military reputation severely damaged by the catastrophic defeat, struggled to rebuild his shattered forces while maintaining his political position in an increasingly unstable Mexican government. The loss of so much equipment and so many experienced soldiers at Cerro Gordo had crippled Mexico's ability to mount effective resistance, forcing the general to rely increasingly on hastily trained militia and whatever foreign military assistance he could obtain. His personal humiliation, particularly the loss of his artificial leg, which became a symbol of Mexican defeat in American newspapers, undermined his authority and contributed to growing political opposition in Mexico City. The young officers who had distinguished themselves during the battle carried the lessons of Cerro Gordo into their subsequent careers, many of which would intersect again during the American Civil War. Captain Lee's reputation as a military engineer and tactical innovator was firmly established, while officers like Joseph E. Johnston and Pierre-Gustave Touton-Beauregard gained valuable experience in coordinated assault operations and the exploitation of tactical opportunities. The professional relationships and mutual respect developed during the Mexican War would make their later confrontation as opponents during the Civil War particularly poignant. For the United States as a whole, Cerro Gordo represented a coming of age as a military power capable of projecting force far beyond its traditional boundaries. The successful coordination of naval and land operations, from the amphibious landing at Veracruz through the mountain campaign, demonstrated American capability to conduct complex military operations in difficult terrain against a determined enemy. European observers, initially skeptical of American military potential, now recognized the United States as a rising power that would need to be taken seriously in future diplomatic calculations. Military historians have consistently identified the Battle of Cerro Gordo as a turning point that demonstrated the effectiveness of innovative tactical thinking over traditional defensive strategies, as documented in numerous scholarly works housed in the U.S. Army War College archives. The tactical innovations employed at Cerro Gordo, particularly the emphasis on detailed reconnaissance, flexible planning, and the willingness to accept significant risks to achieve surprise, became fundamental elements of American military doctrine. The successful flanking maneuver demonstrated that apparently insurmountable defensive positions could be overcome through creative tactical thinking and careful preparation, lessons that would prove valuable in subsequent American military operations from the Civil War through modern conflicts. The battle's conclusion effectively opened the path to Mexico City and made the eventual American victory in the war virtually inevitable. While several more engagements would be fought before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the conflict in 1848, none would match the strategic significance of Cerro Gordo in determining the war's ultimate outcome. The territorial acquisitions that resulted from American victory, including California, Nevada, Utah, and portions of several other southwestern states, fulfilled Polk's vision of manifest destiny and established the continental boundaries that would define the United States for generations. The Battle of Cerro Gordo thus stands as a pivotal moment in American military history, demonstrating how tactical innovation, strategic vision, and personal courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds and alter the destiny of nations. The lessons learned on that April morning in 1847 would continue to influence military thinking and American foreign policy for decades to come, making it truly a key moment that shifted the war toward U.S. success.